don't know why.
Well, because
Oh, the camera.
I'm
You're
like right in front of the camera.
I was like,
I wanna-
partying on the Red Sea.
Okay, can I have your attention? I want to welcome you to the second monthly doctoral student colloquium. We have two great presenters here, and Dr. Smith, I'm going to turn it over to him. He's our moderator for today. He'll introduce the speakers.
Oh, thank you so much. Wow, that's great. Thanks so much. I'm Ryan Smith. I'm the ultimate parliamentarian in the faculty. So I'll make a motion to begin today's colloquium. Anyone second that? Second. About all the rules of order you get. So we have two presentations today. Each presentation will give about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll follow up with 5 minutes of questions, and then for each speaker, and then at the end it's a free-for-all. Please grab your pretzels, your drinks, everything like that. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Seth Jacobson. There's a bio here, that's why I'm carrying this around. Prior to joining the PhD program, Seth, that's you. Seth worked at Drexel University as the assistant director for the Lindy Center for Civic Engagement, where he created and administered programs designed to support student and community development. During that time, Seth earned his MS, his master's degree in global and international education in Drexel School of Education. That's here. As a third-year student, Seth has served as the managing and assistant editor for the academic journals Human Resource Development Review and the Journal of Special Education Leadership. His research explores and promotes the development of diverse, humane, and just organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, Seth Jacobson.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Oh, thank you for writing your bio.
I was going to say, where did you get all that?
Woo! Yeah, pretty good.
Wow. Very impressive.
Chairs.
So thank you for being here, and thank you for having me as Penny for having me as a speaker at the Colloquium. Really excited to be doing this with Cindy. So Cindy and I actually go back. We both worked in civic engagement and community-based work, and so it's really exciting to be here with her and to see the work that she's been doing in the EDB program. So I titled this presentation Marginal Matters, and hopefully by the end of the presentation you understand why I titled it that. But just generally, just a quick overview of what this presentation and what I'm going to try to do within 20 minutes is provide or share with you a conceptual framework that I've been working on for a little over a year now. And I'll tell you all about that. And I will tell you now, too, that this conceptual framework is kind of deep, and there's a lot of layers and complexity to it. I'm not going to go too in-depth. I was actually practicing the presentation before I came, and I realized that I could have probably just done a presentation on the conceptual framework alone. So you probably will have questions afterwards about the framework, and that's fine, and you can talk about them. But I will just kind of do an overview of the conceptual framework, and I'll also talk about a couple of empirical applications, that one in which I'm currently working on, and the other which will hopefully be my dissertation, for which I can apply this conceptual framework, or to which I can apply this conceptual framework. And so let's get to the conceptual framework. And so the title, or one of the things that I called it, and with the help actually of Jamie Callahan and Rachi Ghosh helping me to construct this framework, is a place at the window. And when you hear that, or when you hear or see a place at the window, it probably is a little bit disorienting, because oftentimes you think about this idea or this model of a place at the table, right? We hear about marginalized individuals within organizations or marginalized collectives within societies who, when they wish to seek additional rights, or to seek rights, or to find a degree of voice and agency, they're looking to seek a place at the table. And this obviously is something different. It's a place at the window, and that's kind of reflective of an argument that I make in developing this conceptual framework, which is that focusing on a model for change and development that emphasizes seeking a place at the table often risks reinforcing the power of a social system's most dominant actors, and also reinforces a existing dominant social structure. And when you have a situation where a social structure or dominant actors are in a sense oppressive to individuals, it's incumbent on critical theorists, in my view, to really critique that that kind of model or that kind of strategy or that kind of social structure, deconstruct it, and to try to advocate for something new. And so this is really coming from a critical lens. Can you guys see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. This is really coming from a critical lens. And so that's not to say that this idea of a place at the table or seeking change in that way is not something that happens, and it's also not to say that it's wrong or that there's something that it doesn't necessarily work in terms of advancing change and promoting change. In fact, in a lot of literature and a lot of practice, you see folks kind of pursuing change in that way by seeking a place at the table, by at least going through kind of proper channels, legitimized channels for seeking change, working with those people who are in these formal positions of power and these formal positions of authority to advance change. And oftentimes, this can be reflective of what different scholars refer to as identity politics, or what Katzenstein refers to as interest group activism, which are these ideas of individuals or collectives kind of recognizing that there's something that they're not getting, or there's something that they're being kind of disenfranchised over, and using and kind of claiming that identity or claiming that interest, or seeking a place at the table, working with those folks in those dominant positions within the dominant structure to advance change. As I said, it's not that I don't argue that that's wrong necessarily, but it is problematic, especially if we only look at that and we only focus on that. And in fact, that idea and that model for seeking change is also incomplete, and that it can almost be seen as the tip of the iceberg. And so some other organizational scholars and some social scholars have recognized that marginal actors who are marginalized within organizations and within communities are not just seeking change in that way. They're not just seeking change by way of that strategy of going to the table, of working through those kind of legitimized channels. That marginalized actors are doing other things as well to advance change and development. And so some examples of that are Meyerson and Scully's idea of tempered radicalism, Katzenstein, who also found identity politics functioning within the church and within the military, also saw that marginalized individuals within these institutions were seeking change by way of what she called discursive activism. And Gibbons and Aragon, for instance, who did a lot of work on looking at how individuals within the workplace and within corporations try to advance changes toward LGBTQ-friendly changes. He recognized that identity politics was also happening, and it was happening concurrently to something he called a queer approach to change, which was a little bit more radical. And so one of the issues that I found with, actually, we'll go goodbye. One of the issues that I found with the extant literature that started recognizing that marginal actors were doing more than just this identity politics approach or this interest group activism approach was that, one, it was scarce, there wasn't too much of it. Two, that it seemed to be lacking depth. So for instance, even Meyerson and Scully, although they did really great work on tempered radicalism, and I actually use a lot of it to inform my own conceptual framework, they critique their own work, and they're often critiqued that their work is really lacking in a theoretical base. And a lot of these literatures as well, and a lot of these examples of folks who are looking at the way that marginal actors within organizations are promoting change, a lot of it is really, to me, under theorizing what marginality is and how we can understand marginality and how marginality functions within organizational and collective spaces. And just kind of an example of that, and two researchers that recognize this in their review of literature are Elmers and Jetton, who write that research to date has typically focused on the strategies marginal group members use to ensure a more central position in a group. An implicit assumption underlying this work is that increasing the inclusion of marginal members is not only what is desired by these individuals, but is also what is expected by the group. And so the framework, A Place at the Window, was really an attempt to better understand marginality, specifically with respect to how marginal positionality within organizations and within collective spaces, how that impacts and influences an individual's pursuit of change and development. And to better understand marginality itself, and to just kind of understand better what's happening on the margins in terms of change and development. So the framework is built upon Anthony Giddens' Structuration Theory. And so this is some macro sociological theory that I can't get too into because that can be its own presentation. But it's Anthony Giddens' Structuration Theory. I did have this little figure here which I used to try to explain Structuration Theory in a nutshell. But basically, what Structuration Theory consists of are these three primary components, which is this idea that we have social systems, which is this kind of spiral figure, we have social structure, and we have this structuration, or this process of structuration. And social system this spiral refers to kind of relatively bounded social practices that link persons on a social system across time and space. This structure, which is identified here as this really crappy nucleus-looking thing, is really what is supposed to exist within a social system that's providing behavioral guidance for individuals within collectives, within an organization, or within the social system. And structuration really just reflects a process by which actors in the system, actors within the organization, are either reproducing and reinforcing the structure, that which is providing behavioral guidance, or working to transform or to shape the structure. So Giddens was, as a critical theorist, recognized a sense of agency. So we recognize that we're not only guided by structure, but we have a role in shaping that structure as well, right? And so he says that happens through a process of structuration. Okay, so that's all I'm going to go into in terms of Giddens structuration theory. But I do want to look a little bit more deeply at this idea of structure. So this is something that is supposedly guiding our behaviors and our interactions, right? And so I think it's important to kind of get to know that a little bit more. And so Giddens looks at structure as structure as being as comprising of two major elements, which is a social structure has rules and it has resources, and those rules and resources configured together, that's what's guiding our interactions and guiding our actions within a system. A lot of different sociologists, including Sewell, kind of critiqued Giddens' concept of structure, particularly in that he kind of left rules and resources a little bit esoteric without an understanding of really what are these rules and resources, where do they come from, how do we understand them a little bit better. And so Sewell kind of extended Giddens' work, particularly on structure, and I think what was most significant about what he did and how he extended Giddens' work was the way he treated rules within a social structure. Oftentimes when we hear the word rules in terms of something guiding our behaviors, we think about like codified prescriptions like laws or constitutions, or or in an organization it might be policies or official procedures, and so we think of rules in that way. But Sewell actually argues that those kinds of codified prescriptions are actually resources of a social system. That the rules that are guiding our behaviors and our actions is something deeper, is something rooted in culture, something rooted in cognitive models and shared cognitive models, which he refers to as cultural schema, and other scholars have referred to it as cultural schema. So schemas are generalized collections of knowledge of past experiences, which are organized into related groups and are used to guide our behaviors. Cultural schema, Strauss and Quinn argue, is pretty much the same thing except that it's shared. It's more of a common shared mental model. And resources then, the way that Sewell sees it, is that resources are just an effect of or a manifestation or a consequence of a social system's dominant cultural schemas. And so that resources come about in ways that reinforce the cultural schema, the myriad cultural schema that make up a social system. So just another critical element to just kind of hone in on again when it comes to social systems being comprising of cultural schema as well as resource distributions and resource allocations is that these structural configurations, what I call structural configurations, that kind of mixture of schema as well as resources that kind of instantiate those schema, they organize in a way and they crystallize in a way over time that privileges some actors within a social system and marginalize other actors. That's the nutshell of a really heavy kind of foundation for the framework. So what that does, and what that does for me particularly in looking at marginality and trying to understand marginality and trying to think about ways in which one can be marginalized within a social system, is by thinking about marginality as based on cultural schema and also based on resource and configurations of cultural schema and the resources that are designed to instantiate those cultural schema. And so what I argue, or what I advance, is that individuals can be both marginal in terms of schematic marginality and resource marginality. And so schematic marginality would be the degree to which an actor's cognitive kind of structure or cognitive mental model is incongruent or inconsistent or is in conflict with the dominant cultural schema. And a resource marginality would be a degree to which an actor lacks access to or control over the resources instantiated by dominant cultural schema. And so there's these different levels of marginality that we can think about. Importantly, just in terms of, I'm not going to get too into the prototypic part, but another way of thinking about that is almost congruence or privilege, that you can be schematically privileged or congruent with the dominant cultural schema, or privileged by the way that resources are distributed and allocated and appropriated within a social system. And so that there's kind of a real dynamic way in which we can think about marginality and prototypicality. Importantly, we have to consider context, so marginality is very context-specific, context-heavy. In one context, you can be privileged and prototypic. In another context, you can be marginal, or you could feel a sense of marginality. So it's really important to identify that context. It's also really important when you're thinking about a particular issue to identify what the kind of salient structural configurations are. So kind of identifying what are those underlying assumptions and those kind of resource organizations that are constraining or enabling to actors within a social system. So this is kind of a framework for assessing and exploring marginal positionality within an organization or within a collective, particularly in the way that they may or may not pursue change. Down here is a publication that recently came out in Human Resource Development Review that myself, Dr. Callahan and Dr. Ghosh put out, which gets into this gets into depth a lot more with this. It kind of talks more about what these different categories are, different examples of those categories, as well as propositions for how these different marginal positionalities play a role in change and development processes. So just want to talk really quickly about the empirical applications to which I'm hoping to apply that framework to think about how marginal actors and marginal positionality affects and influences change and development. One is one that I'm working on right now, and that's looking at young adult Catholics. So I'll just say now, both applications kind of have a Catholic context to it. You can ask questions about that later if you want. But the first one, as I said, are young adult Catholics within the church who are oppositional and resistant to a bunch of different structural configurations in the church. That is, they're resistant to different norms and teachings and policies within the church. They're resistant to the structure. And there's a lot of polls and studies that have shown that American Catholics are particularly at odds with a lot of these church teachings and norms. Among that population of adults, young adults are very, very high in resisting these norms and teachings. For instance, Lipka talked about in his research that 90% of young adults that he studied had very favorable opinions toward homosexuality, for instance. And so, in terms of what they're at odds with, they're at odds with a lot of the hot button issues that you probably hear about a lot pertaining to sexuality, homosexuality, gay marriage, women's role in the church, gender, that type of thing. What's also significant is that in spite of these oppositions, they're staying within the church, they're staying within the organization. And the other thing that I wanted to emphasize too, and the reason that I pursued this, was that my fear is if you look at pop culture or pop magazines right now, or just journals, pop journals, or whatever you call them, they are mainstream, we'll say mainstream. They tend to be emphasizing folks in legitimized formal positions of power in terms of what their role is in producing change along these lines. So we all probably have heard of Pope Francis, and a lot of people like him, and a lot of people are really encouraged by him, and they're excited about some of his rhetoric and the things that he's saying, especially with regard to the things that a lot of Catholics are in opposition to and that they're frustrated with. And while I don't necessarily contend that he's not good in terms of promoting some of these changes, he's not the whole story. And he's really just, again, tip of the iceberg of what is happening and what has happened to advance change and development along the lines of those things that Catholics are in opposition to. And so it was really important to me that when we're looking at changes along these lines within the church, that we're focusing on those actors that have been more marginal, that we're not in these formal positions of power, that are marginal and schematically and based on resources. And so I'm pulling young adult Catholics from a young adult Catholic community that's established in Old City, Philadelphia, and the young adults are from all over the world, actually. And I'm in the middle of doing the interviews with them. It's a qualitative study. I'm also doing observations of their community. But again, all of this is really, for me, at this point, a pilot for me to apply that conceptual framework that I talked about earlier to this particular case to understand how these individuals who I'm interviewing, how they understand marginality, their own sense of marginality, and how that marginality is impacting the way in which they pursue and advance change within this kind of transnational global organization, the Roman Catholic Church. Application 2, this is my last slide, I know I'm short. The second application, you can stay tuned for this if you want more depth. This is going to eventually turn into my dissertation proposal defense. But I'll be looking at change and development within a Catholic college in the Northeast region of the United States, particularly looking at how a Catholic college moves from LGBTQIA hostility to LGBTQIA inclusion and advocacy. And so we know that there's a lot of research that exists that talks about, in organizations and schools and the workplace where there is a sense of LGBTQIA hostility, that there's a lot of detrimental effects. So detrimental effects on learning, on retention, on turnover, all that type of stuff. And so as a result, possibly a lot of research has been done to understand how to bring about, more inclusion and more advocacy for LGBTQIA persons. That research really starts to stop when you look at Catholic-affiliated organizations or Catholic-affiliated schools. Probably because we often think of the Catholic Church itself as being relatively hostile to the LGBTQIA community, and that it might be difficult to gain access and all that other stuff. There have been some researchers that have been looking at some colleges, both at the primary and secondary and post-secondary level, and looking at how they have been trying to work toward more inclusion and advocacy. And so my research for this application is building upon that, but also specifically applying my framework to look at how the marginal actors within this particular Catholic college have been and are instrumental and critical to this change and development process. Methods will be highly ethnographic for a lot of different reasons, including methods such as interviews and observations, or tools such as interviews and observations. And that's it.
Thank you. Let's have some now.
Okay.
Seth, you didn't put your article on the reference list.
I had it front and center.
Demerit. Are there any questions for Seth?
I have a question. So you talked about the structuration theory, and I'm just wondering if you could give us sort of a practical example to how that sort of plays out, just so we can better understand.
So the process of structuration?
Yeah. So you talked about the process of structuration, and sort of I guess that's the act of this theory, right? So can you just sort of apply it to like a real life example?
Sure. So I think we could think about it in terms of, let's go back to the church and think about individuals within the church who cultural schema, and let's go back to the LGBT thing as well. Cultural schema and dominant kind of culture and norms are kind of informing, and this is just speculating for an example, are informing actors' actions and interactions within the church as it pertains to what church dominant norms and culture is pertaining to homosexuality. And so as I said earlier, and this is often in every one of my encounters when I talk about homosexuality in the church, right away people are like hostile, bad, negative, right? And that the church says that homosexuality is wrong and bad and it's just a bad, sinful thing, right? And so even without thinking about actual the rule itself or what the catechism actually says, or even without thinking about what the formal rules and procedures or whatever the organization says about homosexuality, that's just kind of the culture. And so that's guiding Catholics, right? That's informing Catholics' attitudes, their beliefs, and their behaviors within the Catholic Church. And that's playing a powerful role, and Giddens talks about, structure, when it comes to structure, when it comes to these rules, that it's usually, the default is kind of habituation or routine, that we kind of just accept it by default a lot of times, especially when it isn't really impacting us in an adverse kind of way. And so you have Catholics, for instance, that are just kind of going through life, saying, yeah, this is, homosexuality is a sin, it's bad, it's a bad thing, and they're kind of conducting themselves in that way, and they're using resources in a way that reinforce that. So they're using the Bible in a way that says, the Bible says that homosexuality, you see it here in Leviticus, you see it here, and so resources are constructed and mobilized and appropriated in ways that help them to make that case and to reaffirm that cultural schema or that culture. And so that's happening, but again, we're not just these kind of blind, people who are just, in the sense of this blind faith. Well, a lot of people do say that. A lot of religious people have this kind of blind faith, and some do. But in terms of sociology and in terms of agency, and Anthony Giddens' idea of agency is that we're not just following. We're also able to go back and transform and shape and be a part of shaping that structure and shaping those norms and shaping the rules and the resources, or reappropriating the rules and the resources. And so I might pull out a different Bible passage and say, well, actually, look what it says about this. And so almost start to work to configure some other kind of structural configuration of schema and resources. That makes sense? Or begin to make sense?
Yeah.
So this is, Giddens is really famous for his idea of what he calls the duality of structure, which ultimately is about that structure is both the medium of interaction, so it guides our interactions, but it's also the outcome of our interactions as well.
We'll take more questions at the end.
Okay.
Just to move things along. So thank you very much, Seth. I was going to say, well, we need to have like some fancy switch, but you guys have already worked that out. So our next speaker is Cindy Rickard. Cindy is one of our EDU students now, currently in the School of Education. Cindy comes to higher education with over a decade of experience in the criminal justice field as an administrator in an alternative school. Her graduate research explored racial disparities in urban juvenile drug use patterns. Cindy currently develops and teaches community-based learning courses and coordinates community outreach for the College of Arts and Sciences, where I hear they have
How do you go on YouTube?
I don't know.
oh, I hear they have donuts at their time.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
Cindy currently develops, her current research includes the effect of civic engagement in student and faculty course experiences. She's presented nationally and internationally on the side-by-side and community-based high resource pedagogy she has developed while at Drexel. So please, huh? Is that it?
Here I am.
Okay. Please welcome Cindy Richards.
This is pretty difficult, isn't it? Well, thank you for.
The switch is there's a switch up there to turn on all the lights.
Oh.
Yeah, that would be better, but I don't know if.
Is that better?
Yes.
Is that going to mess up your video?
It's okay.
It's okay? Okay. Thank you for giving me a couple minutes to really truncate what seems like a ridiculous amount of time and data in my dissertation that I defended last month, which examined.
Yes, you should applaud. She does it.
You need a donut for that.
I do need a congratulatory donut, right? Where I look to examine the emergence of 21st century skills as a result of democratic engagement in this unique community-based learning pedagogy that we call side-by-side here at Drexel. So the purpose of this study was just that, was to measure the acquisition of 21st century skills in this course pedagogy. And let me tell you what side-by-side is. It's an evolution of Temple University's Inside Out program that started 16 years ago. Inside Out brings together incarcerated men and women and college students collectively as a cohort of students. So these students are together as equals throughout a semester, or for our purpose, a term, and they learn everything from criminal justice, which is its origin. It's evolved to every discipline you can think of, from yoga to nursing to law to sociology to English. Well, 5 years ago, a cohort of Drexel faculty, staff, and community partners went on a week training retreat with Inside Out and said, let's pilot this program in the community. It doesn't just have to happen in correctional facilities. And we did just that. And since that time, we've offered, oh my gosh, in the College of Arts and Sciences, over 24 courses in a variety of course locations with community partners. And since the opening of our Dornsife Center for Neighborhood Partnership, the College of Arts and Sciences offered 2 side-by-side classes each term in the neighborhood. So I really wanted to look at what happens in that space, what skills emerge as a result of that pretty unique course pedagogy. So, why do it? There is a call for a national education reform. I mean, the research is replete with saying we need to move beyond standardized testing. We need to move beyond content regurgitation. Additionally, the workforce is saying you're graduating students that don't have the skills that we need. Knowledge is changing at such a quick pace, you need to know what to do versus just, again, regurgitating knowledge. And additionally, I think the applied nature of the EDD program fit really well here at Drexel right now. You know, President Fry came, and during his first convocation speech, where he could have said anything, he charged us here at Drexel to be the most civically engaged institution. So it felt like the perfect storm to really investigate this. The literature for this study came from a lot of different fields. You know, there's a long history since the Morrill Act in 1861, where President Lincoln said, institutions of higher education need to work with farmers and agriculture and come together and co-create knowledge. There's experiential learning theorists from Dewey to Hahn to Freire to Piaget. Additionally, Kuh says, let's look at high-impact practices and the effect that those practices have on things like relationships with faculty, retention rates. Additionally, there's decades of research in service learning, and you'll note, please, that we don't call it service learning. Here at Drexel, we call it community-based learning, because the rhetoric of service really implies a power differential that is antithetical to side-by-side and community-based learning. However, the language in the literature is still service learning, and the language in the literature looking at outcomes is often referred to as soft skills versus 21st century skills. So a lot of this research, I wanted to challenge the rhetoric, not only of service learning, but also moving from this idea of soft skills to those of 21st century, which are much more marketable and I think hold a lot more credibility. And then again, of course, the evolution of side-by-side. There are a lot of gaps. The first is, assessment of these skills. Often in community-based learning courses, and Seth and I actually co-facilitated one about 5 years ago, students will say things like, oh, it was transformative, and I learned so much. And yet traditional assessments don't capture what it is about that unique pedagogy that calls students to describe in such way. They're not captured in course evaluations. And additionally, as part of my work, I use the NSSE survey tool, which is the National Student Survey Engagement Tool. Interestingly, this is a national survey tool, but it's used as a summative assessment. So Drexel uses this as well too. So when seniors graduate from college, we give them this really fantastic, holistic survey tool, and then we never see it again. And it hasn't ever been used as a formative assessment. So for my research, I repurposed it. I repurposed some of the topical modules, which I'll tell you about, and used it again as a pre-post formative assessment. Additionally, colleges and universities are saying we need something more than a GPA. If students are going to really present themselves in the workforce or in graduate school, a simple GPA doesn't tell the whole story. And how can we capture students' learning and experience in an alternative transcript? So my research was a mixed method study design, and there were 3 central questions. The first quantitative question is, how do students' 21st century skills, as measured by that NSSE survey tool, change within a side-by-side course during the 10-week term? And this was a pre-post survey. The second and third qualitative questions, how do side-by-side community, student, and Drexel student pairs describe their learning of 21st century skills? And then lastly, what evidence of this 21st century skills is demonstrated in a side-by-side recorded video of this final presentation? The findings of research question 1. Well, much to my horror, I did composite scores and skills for the 21st century skills. And those 21st century skills that I looked at were civic engagement, experience with diversity, global perspective, course engagement, and transferable skills. And these are skills that were taken out of lots of literature from the workforce saying that these are the skills that we're looking for. These were topical modules already existing within the pool of survey items of the NSSE tool. It came out to be a 70-item survey tool, which I will redo in the next iteration. So I did composite scores of these 5 skills. I did a pre and a post. And again, much to my horror, there was no statistical difference. However, there were 12 questions that did show a significant change from pre to post. And I think that they are important enough that I wanted to run through them just really briefly. So individual t-test paired questions. Students reported that they led a group where people from a different background felt welcomed and included. Students on a Likert scale recorded an increase in contributing to the well-being of their community. They organized others on local or campus issues. They organized others to work on national, state, or global issues. To what extent have your activities or events at your institution emphasized perspectives on societal difference? This question appears that students became more aware of what was happening on campus from pre to post the side-by-side class. When I notice cultural differences, my culture tends to have the better approach. This was a negative scored question, of course. Students didn't become more or less aware, rather. I'm informed on current issues that impact international relations. I saw a statistical change, and I know how to analyze the basic characteristics of a culture. I put the needs of others above my own personal wants. Volunteering is an important priority in my life. They've discussed or debated issues of social, political, or philosophical importance. To what extent has your side-by-side contributed to your ability to learn effectively on your own? Now this was interesting.
What was the sample size?
I'm sorry?
What was the sample size for these?
The sample size. So I had 30 respondents. Now, originally when I piloted this data, I did this for both community and Drexel students, and it simply did not translate for the community students. There were students who had been out of school for 4 decades. There were students, community students, who had not ever completed high school. So one of actually for my future research, and we'll see implications, is to repurpose this again to capture both Drexel and community student voices. But what I held, this was really interesting. This is actually probably one of the most exciting. I held 4 independent variables. I looked at gender. I looked at what year you were in college, your GPA, your major. Had you gone out on co-op yet? To see if any of those variables had any impact on your skill acquisition. And the only independent variable that had any sort of influence on skill acquisition were the students who had taken the University CIUC 101 course. So those students who had a foundation on what it means to be civically engaged and some introduction to engaging with the community had an increase in their global perspective and their course engagement. Additionally, women had an increase in transferable skills, which I can't explain that other than maybe it was a small sample size and a statistical fluke. So in the qualitative research, I was able to capture both the community and the Drexel student voice. And my second question is looking at how do side-by-side community students and Drexel students pairs describe their learning. So I had 6 interviews. There were 3 classes that I used for my data collection. 2 pairs from each class. I sat them in a room. I had 5 semi-structured questions, starting out with like, how would you describe side-by-side to someone? Or what did you learn? And then I had coded using the skills, so I used a priori codes. Here are those skills, and I enumerated. Each utterance was counted if the code definition or theme was reflected in the student's word. And I was able then to distinguish the frequency. And I want to just play in this next clip. You'll see a picture of one of our courses. It was a literature course called Philadelphia Stories. And what you'll hear is a clip from one of my interviews of that Drexel and community student. The sound should be up, so you should all be able to hear this.
What was your experience like this term in your side-by-side course?
I loved it. I loved the concept of the class. I think it's interesting to talk to people from various walks of life, like people who are experiencing things that someone has already been through, or like students who are able to talk to people that are in their field, that are already graduated and have experience. So I think that it's definitely like an experience that I'm right on, basically, at that
example of how the quantitative portion in the survey tool really would not have captured the richness of the course experience. So a mixed method design made a lot of sense. The third research question was looking at a recorded video of the final assignments. All three of the classes, there was a history course, there was a communication public speaking course, and a literature course. And all three had a final presentation or a group project where students were together out in the community gathering information and data. They had to synthesize it and then present it. So I recorded those class presentations and then coded for the skills. After having, I should mention, after coding and enumerating for each of the skills, I then looked at emergent themes from each of the individual skills, which there just simply isn't enough time to go through those. But that was where really a lot of fantastic data came from that will prompt a lot more research. But again, with the video code distribution, I coded each using the 21st century skills. I enumerated it. I did then was able to run C coefficients so I could examine when codes were coded simultaneously and look at the relationship between that code co-occurrence. I'd like to show you next a video clip just as an example of how I used this information, and I'll set this up for you. I was coding the entire class period. So I looked at interaction between student to student, faculty to student. I looked at the content. I looked at the intergroup interaction as well. What I'm going to show you a little glimpse of now is 10 minutes long. I'm not going to show you that. I'm going to show you a minute. But it continues like this for over 10 minutes. The faculty member, the communication faculty member, tells the students, go, it's break time, you have 10 minutes. Go head out. She physically at one point is telling them, go, 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 and you'll see what happens. And I should mention as you watch this, this building does have Wi-Fi, and students do have phones on them. So in this clip, the professor has said, go on a break. She's telling them, go, 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 go. So as I'm, 5 minutes, oh, okay, so I'm coding for things like the classes in the semicircle. At week 10, the students still have name tags on, so there's a sense of community. The faculty member, despite her saying, go, 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 take a break, she continues to go around and talk to students in and of themselves. Not a single student pulls out a cell phone. So again, this is just an example of how I coded and then enumerated that video data. I have 5 minutes left. So I looked at all the skills. I looked at the quantitative. I looked at the two qualitative. With the help of Jen Katz, who's about to enter, which is really timely, I integrated the findings of each of the skills. I was just talking about you. The integration of findings. And was able to look at the enumeration of how many questions versus how many times those skills were present in both of the qualitative data, and were able to really rank it. So my conclusions on this is really, there is a need to graduate students with 21st century skills. The literature told us that. Additionally, the data really demonstrated that students desire to be democratically engaged. However, we really don't have the evidence in the research for this type of civic learning. The findings were very consistent with the conceptual framework in the literature. But the implications, I think, from the quantitative data was the power of the scaffolding of civic learning, and I think that's a future research interest. Additionally, the implications are that this was a high impact practice, and therefore institutions are interested in things like retention. Some of the themes that came out from looking at the qualitative was the engagement with the neighbors, the power of that engagement, as well as the need to evaluate and document for alternative transcripts. My research interest now is really looking at how can I create a tool, because there needs to be revisions from that essay tool, to measure these very important 21st century skills, not only in side-by-side, but in co-op, in community-based learning classes, in co-curricular activities. Is there a tool that we can create to document those 21st century skills? How am I? I'm done? I made it.
Oh,
Okay.
we got time, we got extra time. You can stand or...
Thanks.
You have to,
No, I think that's all.
Sure. I have a question. That was very interesting, thank you. was very interested in hearing about the way you coded the video in particular. I have a question. I just want to make sure I understood.
Sure.
I think you said that you coded, like in week 10, they were still wearing name tags, and you coded that as they have a sense of community. But I wonder if they would take their name tags off if they had a sense of community, just because by week 10 they should know each other's name, right?
Sure, you know, so interesting in that course, that was a requirement of the faculty member, was you come in, you put your name tag on, because that was really highlighted, and that's one of the things that actually we recommend in the side-by-side course format, is that that's just something that you do, and it was a habit. And that was coded, actually, the emergent themes were really fascinating, and just in 15 minutes, there was no way to go through that. But looking at how intentional faculty were with creating a comfortable space. And there were a lot of examples about that. And I think the name tag, for me, I coded that as one of those examples. Even the setup of the room, the fact that it continued to be in a U, was something that I coded, physical space as an example.
So were the name tags an example of community because the instructor intentionally asked them to wear name tags
It was
in an attempt to build community?
It was actually coded as course engagement.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. And the video coding, my goodness, that I have a whole new respect for folks that work with it. It was really laborious. I mean, it was hours and hours of tape that I watched, rewatched, recoded in Atlas TI. Thanks to Jim. Thank you.
Are there other questions for Cindy?
Yeah, I have one.
Sure.
Through your research and this whole process, what 21st century skills stood out to you the most?
Course engagement
Okay.
and civic engagement. You know, again, some of the emergent themes from the course engagement that were the most disheartening and interesting, to be honest, were that students described and faculty demonstrated that when there was a non-didactic classroom experience and a non-hierarchical classroom experience, learning emerged and was valued more. I mean, students in every single interview used the word comfortable. I felt comfortable and therefore was able to learn. The students said, I didn't just have to regurgitate knowledge. You know, it wasn't about regurgitating information, so I was able to take risks. I mean, it was as clear and as apparent and as disheartening, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
It was a pervasive theme.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question. When you talk about a new instrument because you feel the
Sure.
NESI is inadequate, have you identified, you know, like an instrument for each of these 21st century skills that already exist, or are you thinking
Sure.
you have to make one new out of whole cloth, or how are you approaching
So I
it?
definitely don't want to go on the record as saying NESI is inadequate. However, I think NESI could be utilized more broadly. So NESI developed 2 years ago these topical modules, and they didn't assign them civic engagement, experience with diversity, all the skills that they didn't identify them as 21st century skills. However, they aligned perfectly with the literature and workforce development. They just had never been used in a course. And again, they were used independently, sometimes by a handful of universities as summative assessments. So I do think that there's an advantage to having something that we can use in a classroom experience, in a co-curricular experience, to be used, again, as a formative assessment and not that of a summative. I also think that we should challenge the literature of service learning. I mean, the field is having that conversation. Service learning, to me, you know, I think there's lots of issues with that language, particularly when you're in communities of color, particularly when you're in communities that have a history of oppression and you're coming in with a huge power differentiation using the word service learning versus that of a community-based learning and a pedagogy. I also think we need to challenge the language of soft skills. I think that they don't hold the credibility that something like 21st century skills have.
but for your purposes, you thinking you can tinker with the pieces of Nessie to make it work in these different contexts, or you're looking for other instruments, I guess?
No, I think I'm going to tinker with Nessie. Because it's a nationally validated tool, there's a tremendous amount of information that I think would be interesting to other institutions that you really are able to compare regionally. I haven't found anything else that I like better, so I'm going to play around with Nessie, I think.
I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on how you coded by utterance and how you determined what an utterance was.
Thank you. Jen, how many conversations do we have about that? So there is a clear definition, and I can share it with you as well, from each of the topical modules of kind of what counted for experience with diversity. So for example, there were 5 kind of definitions of what that meant with. And then I coded any type of interaction, content, explanation in the interview if it fit that kind of sub-definition as one complete utterance. So it wasn't a word count or anything like that. It was really a thematic video demonstration or verbal utterance.
Can we have questions for you?
You may ask questions to anyone.
Anyone?
Penny, I have one for you.
After me.
What you gonna ask?
Seth, I had a question for you. So this framework that you've developed, do you imagine that this feeding, that it can be applied to any organization or institution?
Question. I hope so. I think that would be great, but I think that's a big part of why I am just starting to pilot it, because I think that I need to, obviously, like the stuff that I was talking about is based on some like very heavy macro sociological theory, and I need I got lost in the sauce for a while, like trying to like develop that and like tinker with it, and now I need to bring it into practical application, and so I think as I begin doing that with the young adults, with the college, I think I'll get a better idea for the possible applications of that framework.
What's the name of your theory?
It's funny because I actually didn't get into it because it would take another like 15 minutes, but it's actually LASSI, which is Legitimate Alternative Structural Configurations, which is that article that we published in Human Resource Development Review talks about how specifically those different marginalities, SMRP and all that other stuff, how they play a role in creating, how they're critical in creating these legitimate alternative structural configurations. I talk about structural configurations as guiding actions and behaviors, and that what's happening also is that marginalized actors are developing something completely different. They're reappropriating cultural schema, or they're extending cultural schema and reappropriating or misappropriating resources in a way that legitimizes alternatives. So it's called LASSI.
Seth, why did you choose the Catholic Church?
I knew someone was going to ask that.
You should have known it was going to be me.
Yeah, no, actually, so I mean, I think it came out of, I think it's a really fascinating place to explore marginality and marginal positionality, especially because it's so hierarchical, and people often feel marginalized as a result of norms and as a result of teachings, as a result of the hierarchical structure. There are so many different ways that you could conceive of marginality, so it's just rich with that. And so I think there's that, but also my own experience in the Catholic Church as being what I would consider a marginal member in a bunch of different ways, as a gay Catholic, as a young adult Catholic, as a lay Catholic. I'm not in any formal position of power in the sense I'm not a priest or a brother or anything like that. And that those experiences have been just really interesting to me, and also interesting to me have been other marginal actors within the church. So I went to a Catholic college where a lot of the Catholic nuns, the Catholic sisters, were really unequivocally trying to bring about change, especially with respect to homosexuality. And their relationships with me reflected how much they wanted to see change, but they, as a result of their position, as a result of being women within the church, on the lower end of that hierarchical totem pole, they had to approach change differently. And they couldn't be as explicit about it. They couldn't be necessarily organizing committees to advance these changes. They had to be really careful about how they approached it. Oftentimes, the way that they interacted with me in talking about it was very dyadic and almost subversive. It would just be like almost like an elevator conversation. And in the elevator, the nun would say like, "I'm all for gay rights," and we get off the elevator and it was gone. So it really started to fascinate me in thinking about how, recognizing that marginality, especially in the church and outside of the church, it really matters, right? Marginal matters. It plays a really big role in terms of how we conceptualize and think about change and development, and who is being included in change processes and who's being included in research pertaining to change and development.
Thanks.
All right, it's 2:57. Seth and Cindy are still here. If you have any other questions to direct their way, I want to thank both of you for participating in a great set of talks, and we appreciate it. Please give them our
Before they go, we have where's Sherry? We have some gift bags over there.
The donuts?
No. In the Irish donut store?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And as we wrap up, I'd like to thank Jamina Williams for organizing everything, and for Sherry for helping with the organization and the gift baskets or whatever you have, bags. But once again, these were great presentations, and it just goes to showcase our two doctoral programs here and the strong type of research that they're doing. So it was a pleasure having you, and thank you for coming. Let's give them another run. And thank you guys for moderating. You did a good job. This will be found on YouTube. So we're YouTube it. So
Did you get
Did it work?
signatures?
Really?
Okay, all right. That's from that guy.
So, what is it?
yeah. So it's
Yeah.